You get sick, and you don't think about it. You just know what you want. Something warm, something bitter, ginger, maybe, or the sharpest tea in the cupboard. Sipped without ever asking why your body is asking for it. Now picture a chimpanzee in a forest in western Tanzania. 3 days into a parasite infection, walking past hundreds of edible leaves to chew on one plant that every other chimp in the group is ignoring. Not eating it, chewing it, swallowing the bitter juice, and spitting out the pulp, the way you'd spit out a pill you didn't want to fully taste. She has no doctor, no textbook, no one to ask. So how does she know? That's the question underneath this entire investigation. And it's stranger than it sounds. Because the answer isn't simply instinct. Most people hear about animals eating medicinal plants and assume it's hardwired. Some ancient reflex baked into the species like a heartbeat. That explanation is comforting. It's also, according to the researchers who've spent decades watching this happen in real time, almost certainly wrong, or at least far too small. In 1987, a primatologist named Michael Huffman was tracking a chimpanzee community in the Mahali Mountains of Tanzania when he noticed a female named Chasiku moving strangely, lethargic, off her food, passing loose, dark stool, a sign, to anyone trained in primate health, of a heavy parasite load. Huffman expected her to rest. Instead, she walked a considerable distance out of her way, selected the young shoots of a plant called Vernonia amygdalina, a shrub so bitter local people call it bitter leaf and mostly avoid it, stripped the bark with her teeth, and sucked out the juice for nearly 20 minutes. Within 24 hours, she was visibly better. Fecal samples later showed her parasite levels had dropped sharply. Here's what made this more than a curious anecdote. Vernonia amygdalina isn't a random forest plant. Local healers in Tanzania had already been using it for generations to treat intestinal parasites and stomach ailments. Chasiku wasn't discovering a folk remedy by accident. She was doing what human medicine had already quietly recognized. Without a single word passed between species, Huffman gave this behavior a name that stuck: zoopharmacognosy. Animals self-medicating. But here's where it gets strange, because once researchers started looking, they didn't find one isolated genius chimpanzee. They found a pattern. Think about what that means. If this were a fluke, a single sick animal getting lucky, it would be a footnote. It's not a footnote. It's a signature, showing up again and again in species that share almost nothing else in common. Take sheep. Not exotic, not clever in the ways we usually praise animal intelligence. Just sheep, grazing in dry country. In the 1990s, animal behaviorists Fred Provenza and Juan Villalba at Utah State University began studying how lambs choose what to eat when different plants contain different toxins. What they found upended the assumption that livestock just eat whatever's in front of them. Lambs offered foods containing tannins, bitter, digestion-disrupting compounds. Would, over repeated exposures, learn to pair that food with something that counteracted it, like foods rich in polyethylene glycol, a substance that binds and neutralizes tannins. Not once. Consistently. The lambs weren't born knowing this. They learned it, through trial, through the internal feedback of feeling worse or feeling better, adjusting their diet like a body running its own clinical trial, one bite at a time. That's the part that should unsettle you a little. It's not instinct in the pure sense, some fixed program installed at birth. It's something closer to experience translated into decision-making. Inside an animal with no language to describe what it's doing or why. Most people assume knowing requires words. Something to think in. A concept you can hold up and examine. Watch a lamb self-correct its own toxin exposure through nothing but taste and consequence. And that assumption starts to look less like a fact and more like a habit of human vanity. And then the pattern goes somewhere even less expected. In 2009, an entomologist named Michael Singer at Wesleyan University was studying woolly bear caterpillars, the fuzzy black and orange larvae common across North America, when he noticed something that shouldn't have made sense. Caterpillars parasitized by flies, ones with fly eggs implanted under their skin, began deliberately seeking out and eating plants containing pyrrolizidine alkaloids, compounds toxic enough to kill the caterpillar itself in high doses. Uninfected caterpillars avoided those same plants entirely. Singer's team ran the numbers. Infected caterpillars that ate the toxic plants had a significantly higher chance of surviving the parasite than infected caterpillars that didn't. The toxin wasn't healing the caterpillar directly. It was closer to chemical warfare fought inside its own body, a substance the caterpillar could tolerate better than the parasite living inside it could. A caterpillar, an organism with a brain smaller than a grain of rice. No capacity for reflection. Nothing resembling a decision in the way you or I would define one. And it was choosing a poison, in the right dose, against a threat it could not see, could not name, could not understand as a threat. If instinct alone explained the chimpanzee, and learning alone explained the lamb, neither one comfortably explains the caterpillar. Something else is happening. Something older and stranger than either word suggests. Which raises the obvious question, how far up does this go, and how far down? Because the deeper the researchers dug, the more it stopped looking like a handful of clever species and started looking like a spectrum. A capacity distributed unevenly across nearly the entire tree of life, present in creatures we'd never think to credit with anything like knowledge. Consider birds. In the early 1990s, ornithologist Larry Clark, then at the Manel Chemical Senses Center, studied European starlings and noticed they were lining their nests with specific aromatic plants, yarrow, among others, chosen not for insulation or comfort, but, the data suggested, for their ability to suppress parasitic mites and bacteria. Nests built with these plants had measurably lower parasite loads and higher chick survival. The starlings weren't randomly gathering vegetation. They were filtering it, selecting for chemical properties invisible to the eye, undetectable by anything except whatever sense a bird uses to register a compound it has never been taught exists. For species, a primate, a mammal grazer, an insect larva, a bird, none of them related in any way that would let this trait pass down through simple shared ancestry, which means it wasn't inherited from one common source. It evolved, independently, over and over, in wildly different bodies with wildly different nervous systems. Because whatever problem it solves was worth solving badly, then a little better, then well enough to survive, again and again, across the entire animal kingdom. That's not a coincidence. That's convergent evolution pointing at something close to a law. And here's the part that should sit with you a little longer than the rest. For most of human history, we assumed medicine began with us. That it started in a temple, a laboratory, a healer's hands, a written record. The chimpanzees complicate that timeline in an uncomfortable way. Some ethnobotanists, researchers who study how human cultures use plants, have quietly proposed that at least some traditional remedies may not have been discovered by humans watching illness and guessing. They may have been discovered by humans watching animals. Not proven, in every case. Scientists are careful with that word, and they should be. The historical record is thin, and correlation between a chimp's diet and a village's pharmacy isn't proof of transmission. But the overlap is documented often enough, across enough separate cultures, that the possibility can't be dismissed as coincidence either. Which means somewhere in the deep, unrecorded past, a person may have watched a sick animal choose a bitter leaf out of hundreds of options, recovered, and connected in their own mind, for the first time, a thing no one had ever needed to write down, that the world was already full of its own medicine, and something inside every sick creature, human or not, already knew how to reach for it. The research cannot fully explain how. Not the mechanism, not completely. Some scientists point to associative learning, the same kind that teaches a lamb which plant follows relief. Others point to something closer to a chemical sense we don't have good language for, an ability to detect compounds the way we detect the smell of rain, without ever consciously deciding to. The honest answer, the one researchers give when pressed, is that it's probably not one explanation. It's several capacities, layered, evolved separately, arriving at the same behavior from different directions. Which means the question was never really, how does the animal know? The question is what knowing was ever supposed to mean in the first place. We built that word around ourselves, around language, around the ability to explain a decision after we've made it. But a caterpillar chewing a plant that could kill it, in a dose calibrated precisely enough to save it instead, has no explanation to offer. It cannot tell you why. It can only do it, correctly, without fail, generation after generation, which might be a more demanding definition of knowledge than the one we've been using all along. So go back to the version of you at the start of this. Sick. Reaching for something bitter, something sharp, without stopping to ask your body why it wants what it wants. You weren't born knowing that ginger settles a stomach. Somewhere, that knowledge passed to you. Through a parent, a culture, a memory so old you never questioned where it came from. But underneath that inherited knowledge is something older still. Something that doesn't need language to work. That was solving this exact problem in caterpillars and starlings and sheep long before there was anyone around to name it, or study it, or wonder whether it counted as intelligence at all. It was never a question of whether animals know which plants heal them. It's a question of how much of what we call knowing was never really about knowing at all.